They had the Pentagon on lock and basically took over Washington. The Vietnam War made the people so angry they shut D.C. down. Come with me today on World Shocking History. You won't believe what you're going to see.
This is actual footage from that horrific day.
A 3-hour parade takes the demonstrators across the Potomac on their way to the Pentagon. The crowd, estimated at about 50,000 persons, was a loose confederation of some 150 groups and included adults, students, even children. It is at the Pentagon where the first test of strength comes.
One of the largest and most symbolic protests took place at the Pentagon, the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense, which represented the military establishment and U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The march was organized by the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, MOB, and attracted a mix of students, clergy, pacifists, and civil rights activists.
Military police contain the crowd, but clashes soon break out. Federal marshals arrest several who attempt to break through the protective line. Reinforcing the marshals, a second wave of MPs with fixed bayonets in scabbards move into position. Some 400 demonstrators are arrested, 2 soldiers are injured, and tear gas is used. 6 break into a Pentagon side door, but are quickly apprehended in the day-long disturbance. The next day, campfires are lighted to hold off the autumn chill. The same weekend saw nationwide demonstrations supporting American GIs in Vietnam. The Pentagon protest was less violent in its second day of sitting in. The 2-day protest ends with over 600 arrested and the widespread opinion that the demonstration made everyone.
This is no longer a demonstration, it's a siege. Tear gas fills the air, clubs swing, arrests pile up, 681 people dragged away. A female protester places a flower in a soldier's rifle barrel, creating one of history's most iconic images. This single day changed everything. The image of Americans fighting Americans on the Pentagon steps turned millions against the war. The peace movement would never be ignored again.
The next day, campfires are lighted to hold off the autumn chill. The same weekend saw nationwide demonstrations supporting American GIs in Vietnam. The Pentagon protest was less violent in its second day of sitting in. The 2-day protest ends with over 600 arrested and the widespread opinion that the demonstration made everyone a loser.
Thousands of protesters reached the Pentagon's outer grounds. Some attempted a symbolic entry, carrying human Vietnamese-style coffins or burning draft files. The goal was more symbolic than practical. They wanted to show the human cost of the war, not actually take over the building. Confrontation with authorities. The U.S. Army had stationed tanks, National Guard troops, and barbed wire to protect the Pentagon. While some protesters climbed the steps, they were quickly blocked or arrested.
Anti-war demonstrators protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War in mass marches, rallies, and demonstrations. Central Park is the starting point for the parade to the UN building. The estimated 125,000 Manhattan marchers include students, housewives, beatnik poets, doctors, businessmen, teachers, priests, and nuns. Makeup and costumes were bizarre. Before the parade, mass draft card burning was urged. Demonstrators claimed 200 cards were burned, but no accurate count could be determined. Reporters and onlookers were jostled away on purpose. Although mostly peaceful, shouted confrontations were frequent and fiery during the course of the march. The anti-war marchers were picketed by anti-war marchers who were hawkish toward the parading doves. Civil rights leader Martin Luther King leads the procession to the United Nations, where he urges UN pressure to force the U.S. to stop bombing North Vietnam. Police arrested 5 persons as disorderly. 3 were grabbed when they rushed the parade float. No serious injuries, however, in New York's biggest anti-war march.
The October 1967 Pentagon riot, the first national protest against the war, exemplified the agonizingly divisive debate over Vietnam. Ironically, the demonstrators helped the federal government confirm its own commitment to civilian control. Civilian deputy marshals, not soldiers, arrested them. The deputies were fulfilling the historic role of U.S. Marshals, for each arrest affirmed the enduring concept of civilian supremacy in the United States. What was the impact? Media reports indicated that peace activists still faced significant challenges in swaying public opinion. News stories emphasized sporadic, controversial incidents, while conservative commentators drew attention to communist organizations' involvement. Although Americans held divided views on the war itself, polling revealed broad consensus that, as one survey put it, anti-war demonstrations
Mr. McNamara said that the raiding U.S. jets hit Dong Hoi Barracks, where most Red troops are equipped for their forays to the south. In the first raid, land-based planes were forced back by the weather, but the carrier jets completed their strike with the loss of one American plane. Later, photo reconnaissance flights proved that much of the staging area had been completely destroyed. The confrontation between the Reds and the West was the most critical since the Gulf of Tonkin incident last summer, when the U.S. replied just as swiftly to North Vietnam PT boat attacks. Spring at home, but unmindful of clock or calendar, the Vietnam struggle goes on. A Viet Cong ambush of a U.S. Marine Rough Rider truck convoy kills one American leatherneck, wounding 4 others. Many vehicles were damaged, 2 destroyed. Elsewhere, South Vietnamese and American troops keep supply lines open while attacking a huge Viet Cong installation. The enemy camp was first pounded by heavy fire from ships and landing boats, providing cover for the assault wave foot soldiers. When the smoke clears, the inevitable roundup of prisoners, many of them seriously wounded. Among the captured, a large group of women, traditionally used by the enemy as ammunition bearers, village infiltrators, and informers. At least 18 VC soldiers were killed in this joint Allied sweep. Battle-weary feet, a soldier's nemesis. The brief pause allows communication with the ever-present field choppers, which pick up both Allied wounded and the captured enemy. Spring at home, but in Vietnam, a war that knows no... A 3-man junta has been named to rule the Dominican Republic as a rebel movement collapses. It was an attempt to reinstate exiled President Juan Bosch, and U.S. Marines were ordered into the country to protect American lives. The Leathernecks were airlifted to the capital of Santo Domingo, where they killed 2 snipers who attacked the U.S. Embassy. President Johnson ordered the troop movement when it appeared doubtful that a stable government could be established immediately. The rebels claimed rule of the country, but their regime collapsed when neutral naval and army units joined government forces led by General Wesson. He was the leader of the rebellion in 1963 that ousted President Bosch on charges that he was pro-Castro. Meanwhile, the U.S. Marines have also taken center stage in South Vietnam. No longer a defensive force at the Da Nang Air Base, they have been ordered to fan out on a wide perimeter to flush out rebel Viet Cong positions. On land and afloat, they patrol around the clock, and for the time being at least, these forays seem to have put an end to communist night raids on the strategic air base. The Marine forces are mobile and can be moved quickly to any point that calls for emergency action. An alarm to strengthen a remote outpost brings Marines on the double. They are ready with speed and dispatch. In Santo Domingo and in Da Nang, the Marines uphold their great tradition. The President reaffirms United States policy in South Vietnam in a talk to the Association of American Cartoonists. These social satirists hear Mr. Johnson describe Red China as a hungry tiger ready to devour all of Asia, using North Vietnam as a cat's paw.
Their target is not merely South Vietnam. It is Asia. Their objective is not the fulfillment of Vietnamese nationalism. It is to erode and to discredit America's ability to help prevent Chinese domination over all of Asia. In this domination, they shall never succeed. And I am continuing and I am increasing the search for every possible path to peace.
The President visualizes a peaceful, prosperous Vietnam once the fighting can be brought to an end at the conference table. He outlined past aid to South Vietnam since it became independent in 1954 and extended a hand to the communist North to partake of the fruits of what could be peaceful progress with a $1 billion assistance program. He called on the Soviet Union to join with other industrial nations to assure Vietnam's progress. Our efforts in war or peace will continue, he said, and he looked toward tomorrow.
It will be there when peace comes to us, and so will we. Not with soldiers and planes, not with bombs and bullets, but with all the wondrous weapons of peace in the 20th century. And then perhaps together, all of the people in the world can share that gracious task with all the people of Vietnam, North and South
As we
alike.
reach the end of our examination of the Vietnam War protest movement, we must understand that behind every chant, every march, and every act of civil disobedience stood deeply wounded human beings, Americans who watched in anguish as their country pursued what they saw as a senseless and immoral war. The protesters weren't simply angry, they were heartbroken. They were Americans who felt betrayed by their own government, a government that was sending their brothers, their friends, their classmates to die in the jungles of Southeast Asia for reasons that made less sense with each passing year. Imagine the emotional weight carried by young men who received draft notices, knowing they might be forced to kill or be killed in a war they didn't believe in. The depression, the sleepless nights, the impossible moral choices. Some fled to Canada, abandoning everything they knew. Others went to prison rather than compromise their conscience. These weren't easy decisions. They were soul-crushing dilemmas that left permanent scars. Consider the parents who lost their sons, not just to death, but to a war that seemed to have no purpose, no end, and no victory in sight. By 1968, over 500 Americans were dying every single week. Each death notice was a family destroyed, a future erased, and for what? Protesters watched as the government's explanations shifted like sand, fighting communism, protecting democracy, preserving credibility. Nothing felt like truce. Nothing felt worth the cost. The financial waste added insult to injury. While American cities crumbled, while poverty and racism remained unaddressed, the United States was spending over $2 billion every month on the war. That's money that could have built schools, hospitals, and housing. Instead, it bought napalm and Agent Orange. It funded a war machine that seemed to devour resources without achieving anything meaningful. The emotional stress of the protest movement itself cannot be overstated. These activists faced ridicule, violence, and arrests. They were called traitors and cowards. They were beaten by police, expelled from universities, and sometimes killed, as at Kent State in 1970, when National Guardsmen opened fire on unarmed student protesters, killing 4 young people whose only crime was speaking out. The protesters carried the burden of feeling like Cassandras, prophets whom no one would believe. They could see the futility, the waste, the moral corruption, but those in power wouldn't listen. Year after year, they marched and pleaded and raged, watching the body count rise, watching the war expand into Cambodia and Laos, watching their predictions of disaster come true while being told they were naive, unpatriotic, or worse. Many protesters suffered from what we might now recognize as moral injury, the psychological damage that comes from witnessing acts that violate one's deepest values. They saw their country, which they had been taught to love and respect, committing what they viewed as atrocities: the My Lai massacre, the carpet bombing of Cambodia, the use of chemical weapons. These revelations didn't just make them angry, they made them question everything they'd been taught about America. Depression swept through the protest movement. Some activists burned out completely, unable to sustain the emotional intensity required to keep fighting. Relationships fractured, families divided. The war created a generational chasm, with young people feeling fundamentally alienated from their parents' generation, unable to understand how they could support such carnage. And beneath all the anger and activism was profound grief. Grief for the 58,000 American lives lost, grief for the millions of Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian civilians killed, grief for what America could have been if it had chosen a different path, grief for innocence lost, both personal and national. When we remember the Vietnam War protesters today, we should remember them not just as political activists, but as emotionally devastated human beings who cared so deeply that they were willing to sacrifice their own comfort, safety, and social standing to speak truth to power.
Thank you for watching this important moment in our history. If you thought this was shocking, wait till you see the next video about a cat that the CIA pays $20 million for. You won't believe what they did to that cat.
Please hit the subscribe button, like, and share this video. Thank you for watching.